Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts, the home of objective, up-to-date and independent reporting on Turkey. Don't forget to follow our reports through social media, on ahvalnews.com or through our mobile app. Let's get started.
Hello and welcome to Ahval Podcasts. I'm Hala Akay and today we want to discuss the relation between Islamism and nationalism in Turkey. Our guest is Birol Başkan, a non-resident scholar at the Middle East Institute. His research broadly focuses on religion and political order in the Middle East. Welcome, Mr. Başkan, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
So let's start with the most recent discussions. Today, many in Turkey say that Turkey's Islamism, represented now by the Justice and Development Party or the AKP, since 2016 made a deal with both right and left-wing nationalisms. Against that claim, others argue that Turkey's Islamism has always been nationalist, but appeared less so for a decade in the beginning of the century for political reasons. If we look at from a historical perspective and start with Necmettin Erbakan's Islamist national vision, what has been the relation between Turkey's Islamists and nationalists?
Aside from the sometimes technical, sometimes strategic alliances and counter-alliances between Turkey's Islamists and nationalists in Turkey, I would like to look at from the ideological perspective, how these two ideologies fit or unfit for each other. Turkey's Islamism or Islamism in Turkey has its intellectual roots in the 19th century. Some say it's the young Ottomans are the first Islamists. Of course, there were other things, but also their writings contain the seeds of what later became Islamism. But as a distinct school of thought in Turkey, Islamism emerged or flourished in the second constitutional period, or in the first quarter of the 20th century. And that time, one of the questions that were in front of then really early generation of Turkish Islamism was that what would be the identity base of the political community of Muslims. And there was this very famous piece written by Yusuf Akçura, I guess. Which highly three ways of standing. I couldn't remember the Turkish title of that very famous piece, but it basically asserted that there is the nationalist position, there is the Islam position, and then there is also Ottomanism. And of course, Ottomanism was a kind of an American identity that we now have, which is supra-ethnicity, supra-religion, which basically said every Ottoman citizen was an Ottomanist or Ottoman or belonged to that identity. And Turkish nationalists said that it's the Turkish ethnicity which is going to be the identity base of the political community of Muslims. Islamists claim against both, saying that Islam is the true identity base. Being Muslim is the true identity base, and that would save the empire better than the others. So in the origin, it seemed that Turkish Islamism or Islamism in Turkey rejected nationalism, but that is on the surface, it is true, but it is very deceptive. And actually, it's the opposite. Turkish Islamism embraced nationalism, but rejected ethnic nationalism. And if you look at the writings of early generation of Islamism, they really don't say Islamism or milliyetçilik is against Islamism, but they use the term kavmiyet, which is really can be translated as ethnic-based nationalism. So they sort of embraced nationalism. And some of them even claim that, for example, Müslümanlık bir millettir, or if I translate it in Turkish, being a Muslim or Muslimness is its own nationality. So they embraced nationalism, but they basically they transformed into into an Islamic concept. And still, we have that double usage. Sometimes they never use for example, the Turkish word ulus to describe millet, and millet is the one which Turkish Islamists since then have used to describe that mass that have their in mind. And that is the defining characteristic of that mass of people, is that they are Muslim. So Muslimness is the political identity they attributed to that mass of people that live under then Ottoman Empire and then the Turkish Republic. So in Turkish Islamism, there is no tension between being nationalist, understood as being Muslim, not really Turk, ethnic Muslim, but rather being a Muslim, and that is the nationality. That is the nationality of Turkish Islamism. And if you remember, of course, Necmettin Erbakan's it's called nationalist vision or national vision, which is milli görüş, also uses the same terminology, milli, which is actually a term from the Quran. Quran uses this term repeatedly, referring to many different things, but essentially it's a group of people. But what unite them is sometimes cannot be that clear. But in the Ottoman usage, of course, millet is used to refer to the group of people who share the same religion. So from a Turkish Islamist perspective, nationalism is not a bad thing. Nationalism is not something that is rejected out of hand by religion, but embraced in religion. So ideological wise, Turkish Islamism is nationalist, but not ethnic nationalist. I should emphasize again, but more like a religious nationalism. There is no contradiction between these two terms. So when they turned against, they became more nationalistic, and they dropped earlier liberal democratic discourse and became more nationalist right now. There's no contradiction actually in terms of ideology. And if you really place Turkish Islamism, starting with Necmettin Erbakan, and even before Said Nursi and others, Turkish Islamists have been deeply embedded in the Turkish right, which as nationalists have been part of that right. And of course, this reminds me of Tanıl Boraz's book, right? The Türk Sağının Üç Hali. One of them is really Islamism. So it's not really surprising that Turkish Islamists can go along well with nationalists today, whether it is MHP, which is nationalist party, right nationalist party. What is really surprising is, of course, that the AKP is now in alliance with the left wing nationalists, which are, I presume, represented by Doğu Perinçek, but I don't know whether he can be described as left wing nationalist purely or something else. I guess that is the surprising part, not the alliance with MHP.
So also many perceive the Islamist movement in Turkey as a monolithic one, but in fact that's not true, especially that was not true in the past. Islamism in Turkey was in fact a brand that brought together different schools of thoughts, traditions, which sometimes contradicted with each other. So do you also share that opinion, and do those differences in Islamism in Turkey still exist, or have those schools of thoughts, traditions, groups somehow lost their personality now?
Well, I mean, if you look at even the Ottoman period, if I use that term, the religious market in Turkey, in today's Turkey, I mean, religious market being the suppliers of religious services. And if you really look at that even in the Ottoman Empire, it was an extremely pluralistic religious market in terms of the people who act in the name of religion. We are speaking of tens of different tarikats today, Sufi orders, of course, in addition to the usual state allied ulama class. So it was an extremely pluralistic market. When there were attempts to homogenize this market, of course, from time to time, but for example, second Mahmud, the Mahmud II, for example, basically destroyed the Bektashi Sufi order, which undermined that plurality, but allowed the Sunni Sufi orders even flourish more. Another attempt came with, of course, during the early period of Republic, when basically the Republic nationalized all mosques in Turkey and put them under the director of the religious affairs, Diyanet. But still, the Republican reform was not brutal against religion, as if you compare it, for example, to Russia. In Russia, the communist revolution basically came to destroy, to eradicate religion. The Republican reforms were much more mild in terms of trying to what to do with religion. And that's the question modernity, of course, proposed, right? Presented to state builders or modernizers. What are you going to do with religion? The Republic's answer was that, okay, we are going to reform religion, but make out of from it a pliant Islam, a depoliticized Islam, an Islam serving political order in Turkey, and Islam which is going to be strengthening the state or in alliance with the state. And over the course of that, the Mustafa Kemal and his friends, his colleagues, did not really eradicate Sufi orders, even though he shut down the Sufi orders, but really allowed them to continue their activities inside mosques and from outside of the public eye. That's why, for example, today most of the Sufi orders, we name them after a certain mosques. Because if you really look at their sheikhs, their leaders, they have been employed by the Diyanet as imams of those mosques. And there was this tacit sort of understanding between the Sufi orders and then the republics that keep your activities outside of the public eye, and we will let you go on activities underground, and we will not molest you if you do not really challenge the state. Well, there were attempts to challenge the state, of course, and then the Republic was harsh against them. But most of the time, the challenge was muted. The challenge was not open, and sort of came to an understanding that, okay, let's leave each other alone. So the Republican reforms were not like communist Russian reforms, which sought to eradicate religion, instill in people atheism, literally atheism. That there is no God, there is no religion, so on. So the Republic did none of that. So the Turkey really kept the same pluralistic religious market it inherited from the Ottoman Empire. Of course, much more homogeneous than the Ottoman Empire, because one of the effect of the Republican reform was actually Sunnification of the religious market. Because even though the Sunni Sufi orders leaders, they were incorporated into the very Sunni again directorate, the Bektashis or the Alawites, for example, did not enjoy the same benefits. They were not incorporated into the state, even though their Sufi orders and belongings were closed down and their foundations were nationalized by the state. So it sort of homogenized the religious market, but not as much as it maybe should have. So Islamism in Turkey flourished in terms of actors, religious actors that are operating in that market, in a highly pluralistic religious market. So in that religious market, what could have Islamism really proposed to ordinary man? Really not much. So what happened is that Turkey's Islamism did not really transform into a social movement, a political movement like the kind we see in Egypt, for example, the Muslim Brotherhood. a massive mass movement, which is Islamist in terms of ideology, but also a social movement, or the ones you see in other Muslim countries like the Mevdudi's Jamaat Islami, which is an Islamist organization, which is modern, but has become grassroots organization. So the Turkish Islamism, on the other hand, has not become a grassroots movement, but rather the people who sort of embrace Islamist ideas became attached to different religious groups. Of course, most of them were tariqat. The only religious movement which is originated as an Islamist originally because of its founder, Said Nursi, who was an Islamist in the late Ottoman Empire. But of course, he dropped most of his Islamist ideas in his fight against the Republic. Nurculuk was the only mass movement that I can think of, which originated as an Islamist, but later on very much moderated its ideas, which can be described as Islamist. So Islamists in Turkey are much more like, we are talking about individual religious intellectuals who have some attachments to this group or that group. Even if you look at the first sort of Islamist party in Turkey, Necmettin Erbakan's. Necmettin Erbakan was a disciple of a Sufi leader. If you look at the other people who allied with him in the first place, they were also members of other Sufi groups. And of course, Nurculuk also provided some people to Erbakan's Islamist parties. So Erbakan's parties were not really a movement on their own, but more like a coalition of religious groups in Turkey. These recruiting people from other religious groups and trying to mobilize them after a political goal. Well, if you really look at it, the Justice and Development Party was no different. In terms of, it is not a religious movement per se. It is more like a group of religious political leaders who embrace certain Islamist ideas, but eventually rely very much on other religious groups, grassroots religious groups, and mobilize them after a political order. Of course, Justice and Development Party, thanks to its being in power for the last 17 years, extended patronage over all religious groups in Turkey. So the outcome might really be that they might have lost their personality. But still, this is not even the Justice and Development Party is not a monolithic on its own. So in the first instance of weakening, I guess these religious groups will part their ways and assume their own identities, their own personalities. So whatever appears right now as a monolithic Islamist movement is I guess is deception. I don't think that is the case. But of course, because of the immense power Justice and Development Party accumulated in state, I guess no religious group right now, except for a few ones like Alparslan Kuytul and some others, none of them really can stand up against just the domination of the Justice and Development Party. But in terms of other than that, it doesn't seem to me that they have lost their personality and absorbed into one monolithic religious movement.
Mm-hmm. So if we continue with that discussion, some also say that, for example, even if the AKP loses power and those groups revive themselves again, in fact, they killed themselves intellectually by surrendering to power, so they have lost their legitimacy. So they will never be that appealing as they were used to be Do you support that opinion?
Well, that's academics are not really good in predicting the future. So I really don't know. I cannot speak of that certainly. As I said, most of these religious groups are not after the Justice and Development Party because of some ideological commitment, because of most of the time because of the perks they receive from the party. So do they lose their legitimacy in the eyes of their constituency? I don't know. But they have definitely lost their certain credibility in the eyes of the secular groups in Turkey. If you go back to the 1990s and early 2000s, one of the reasons why Justice and Development Party could overcome the challenge the Kemalists posed was because they could mobilize very diverse groups in society, especially the secular parts, including the Kurds, including the Alawites, including the liberal Democrats. Of course, the latter is much more intellectual, not in terms of vote, but in terms of the story, in terms of the story, the vision that the party right now puts in front of the Turkish public, I guess religious groups lost their credibility of putting Turkey onto a path to more liberal democratic. In that regard, they lost credibility. But other than that, I don't think that. We should really look at from the eyes of the conservative people, not from the eyes of the liberals. Well, as far as I know, many nationalists are very pro AKP, very pro Erdogan right now. So it seems that the party, the Justice and Development Party, is offering them some ideological and material benefits, and then some other people are buying it. But definitely, of course, I don't think that anyone with a sound mind right now in Turkey would believe in any democratic credentials of the party. If that's a loss, that's a loss. But other than that, I don't think that Turkish Islamism is dead, and as some people are calling it. I guess that's a very famous quote, right, by American writer. There was a speculation about his death, and then he says that my death is greatly exaggerated. I guess the death of Turkish Islamism is greatly exaggerated. I don't think that it is dead. It is dead in the eyes of some liberal Democrats.
So let's pass to foreign policy. Turkey has been pursuing an aggressive foreign policy in the last couple of years, and some say that the government is pursuing a nationalist agenda. Some say that it is, in fact, that agenda is in fact pan-Islamist or neo-Ottomanist. So what is the main ideology that drives Turkey's foreign policy at the moment?
Well, going back to your first question, I guess pursuing a nationalist agenda, pan-Islamist agenda, or neo-Ottoman, these are not really mutually exclusive agendas. They very much overlap especially in the eyes of the conservative people, and then in the eyes of Islamism in Turkey. So pursuing a national agenda can be a pan-Islamist agenda and neo-Ottoman agenda at the same time. I guess they are not really mutually exclusive of one another. This is again because of the particular way Turkey's Islamism embraced nationalism in the case of Turkey. And of course, some might argue that, well, it is also in alliance with the Turkish nationalist goal. Okay, I don't see how a Turkish Islamist and a Turkish nationalist would disagree on making Turkey great again, if I use Trump's words, or adapt it to Turkey. So why a Turkish Islamist would disagree with Turkish nationalist in making Turkey great again. If making Turkey great again is a nationalist agenda, I guess it's also an Islamist agenda, because in order to understand this, I guess we should really look at deep into the Islamist imagination in Turkey, how they see the Turkish nation, how they see Turkey. In the eyes of the Turkish Islamists, Turkey is the seat of the last caliphate. And then it is where, again, and it's the only power, it is the only state in the Muslim world which can revive the greatness of the Muslim world again. So reviving Turkey's power or making Turkey great again is equal to making the Muslim world great again. So, but from a Turkish nationalist perspective, of course, this is limited to making Turkey great again, and then maybe helping the Central Asian Turkic republics along with that. But they are not really competing agenda, but more like they are complementing each other, they are supplementing each other, they are helping each other. I guess Turkey is pursuing all of that. It's nationalist at the same time, it's pan-Islamist at the same time. And if you call it neo-Ottoman, okay, I don't object to that one. But again, all these ideologies are not in conflict with each other in the way they interpret those ideologies. Turkey, I guess the ruling party in Turkey has been pursuing pan-Islamist ideals, sometimes openly, sometimes discreetly, and that is really, if you put it in one word, that is the unity of the Muslim world, or the Ummah, and make that Ummah strong again, so that it can stand up against the West, against China, against Russia. So at the root of that foreign policy, I guess, stands this desire to make Turkey and the Muslim world great again. This has been so, I mean, since the late 19th century. I mean, one of the reasons why Islamism was born is to save the empire, so that it will not, go. Because most of them, if you look at, for example, the poems of Mehmet Akif, for example, you see, if he's really crying that the last Ottoman Empire, the last Muslim empire, which is the Ottomans, are declining. And with that decline will come really the end of Islam. This is most of the Islamist writings of that period were apocalyptic in the sense that, okay, if we lose this empire, we'll lose Islam, so that Islam is going to be evaporated. So we should save Islam. So in many cases there are imperial reflexes, there are nationalist reflexes, there are pan-Islamist reflexes. They are all in one bag. So I guess that is the intellectual question that has driven Turkish foreign policy. Yeah, during the just and development part period. Yeah.
So, if I may ask one other question related to that. So, in the 1990s, especially secularists in Turkey were accusing the Islamists of importing schools of thought from several Middle East countries.
Yeah.
One of them you mentioned is the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt. There was a strong Iranian branch. There were Salafis, or groups much more related to Saudi Arabia, etc. Or that was the secular vision. But mainly Turkey was seen as an importer of ideology, Islamist ideology from the Middle East.
Yeah.
But today, the Turkish government, is supported by many in the Middle East. But has Turkey become a country also now exporting ideology to the Middle East?
Well, that's itself a research question of a big proportions, of course. I mean, I cannot really, currently I am working on those questions myself, but my preliminary observations is based on my preliminary observation, I can say this. I mean, look, I mean, when we speak of Islamism, we are not really speaking of a very dense, very thick ideology. We are talking of a set of slogans about Islam, a sort of slogans that can really travel across the Muslim world very easily, which can be accepted without any question. So we are not really talking about an ideology very thick, very descriptive, very descriptive and very detailed. So we are really talking about an ideology which is very thin. In the literature on ideology, that they make this distinction between thin ideology and thick ideology. Thick ideologies are those which describe in detail what kind of a utopia or what kind of a social and political policies the state should pursue. But in thin ideologies, you really appeal to the emotions, not rationality, like nationalism. Islamism is one of those. Islamism makes a couple of sloganic claims about Islam, which, for example, one of is that Islam is a solution. Islam is a solution to all problems of mankind. Okay, what are those solutions, really? I mean, if you really go through the Islamic literature, you don't see much solution. So what I am coming at is that if you see similarities between Turkish Islamism and for example, the Muslim Brotherhood, it's not because someone is importing someone's idea, it's because what is important is so simple. And those imported, those simple slogans were also expressed by Turkish Islamist literature in the early 20th century. Many things that can be attributed to Muslim Brotherhood, for example, were voiced by the early generation of Turkish Islamists in terms of like Islam is a solution, Islam is perfect, Islam is this, Islam is that. So I don't think that Turkish Islamism needed to import, say, from the Muslim Brotherhood or from Salafism. I mean, these are such ideologies which can really penetrate into the religious field without much challenge, except Salafism in Saudi Arabia. And that's a totally different topic. I wish you don't bring that topic in our today's podcast, but it's Salafism and Islamism is sometimes in full tension, sometimes they are not. That's a different question. But in the case of Turkey, for example, some of the slogans about Islam, which are voiced by Islamists, right now are embraced by many Sufi orders. So the reason being is that they are sloganic and they don't carry much weight in terms of, okay, we are going to solve, let's say, the problem, this economic problem. So what's the Islam solution? Not much, really, except for, okay, let's abolish interest rate, which is not abolished in any place in the Muslim world, by the way. Even in Saudi Arabia, you have banks which are charging interest rate, which literally implement the Sharia. So what is the solution? Okay, let's abolish interest rate. Who abolished interest rate? No one. And then in its place, you have this, what's called Islamic banking. I don't know how Islamic is that. I'm not a theologian. I cannot judge that. But it seems to be more like an incorporation into the capitalist economy, nothing else. Not through interest rate, but something else, a version of it, a variant of interest rate. So my question is, I guess this charge is much more polemical and political than scholarly and academic. Mm-hmm. It's more like in order to sort of discredit Turkish Islamists in the eyes of the public. The seculars in the 1990s might have accused Turkish Islamists of importing ideas, but really what is to be imported? Not a big deal. I guess what is important or what is not important is so sloganic that I would not call that importation. And again, I guess it is much more like a polemical, because in the 1990s, nationalist Islamist parties were rising, and then the Kemalists or secularists were very much concerned about their rise. So in order to discredit them in the eyes of the public, they said they are important. Well, the same charge, by the way, is now raised against the Muslim Brotherhood in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia is saying the same thing. Oh, this is an important ideology. UAE is saying the same thing. So it's almost as if but it's more polemical than scholarly. As I said, there is nothing in Islam is so deep that one cannot think of on its own, so that you have to rely on others.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Başkan, for that conversation.
I thank you for having me.
And thanks everyone for listening us. Goodbye.